I grew up in a small town in southern Saskatchewan where the winters stretched from October to April, and the cold could kill you if you weren't careful. The kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where Friday nights meant driving around on gravel roads with nowhere to go, where the biggest source of entertainment was seeing how much trouble you could get into without your parents finding out. The town sat on the edge of a lake that froze solid every winter, thick enough to drive trucks across, and that's where we spent most of our free time during the cold months. It was January of my senior year when it happened. I was 17, and my friends Tyler and Jesse had convinced me to drive out to the lake with them. It was a Friday night, bitterly cold, the kind of cold where your breath freezes in your lungs and exposed skin burns within minutes. But we were young and stupid and thought we were invincible, so we loaded up Tyler's dad's truck with a case of cheap beer and some firewood and headed out onto the ice. We parked near the old fishing huts, weathered wooden structures that had been abandoned for years, slowly collapsing under the weight of snow and time. The lake stretched out around us in every direction, a vast white emptiness broken only by pressure ridges and the dark shapes of the huts. The sky was clear that night, stars bright and sharp against the blackness, and the moon was just a thin crescent hanging low on the horizon. We built a fire right there on the ice, piling up chunks of old wood from one of the collapsed huts and dousing it with lighter fluid until it roared to life. The flames threw dancing shadows across the frozen surface, and we huddled around it, drinking and talking and trying to stay warm. Tyler had brought his dad's old radio, and we listened to static-filled music from a station out of Regina, the sound thin and distant in the open air. Around midnight, Jesse stood up to take a piss, and that's when he saw them. "What the hell is that?" he said, pointing at the sky. Tyler and I looked up. At first, I thought they were just stars, maybe satellites passing overhead, but then I realized they were moving. 3 bright lights, pulsing with a soft white glow, moving in perfect formation across the sky. They weren't like anything I'd ever seen, not planes, not helicopters, not the northern lights. They moved too deliberately, too smoothly, gliding across the frozen expanse of the lake like they were on rails. "Probably just military," Tyler said, but his voice was uncertain. "Training exercises or something." We stood there watching as the lights moved closer, their formation never breaking. They were completely silent. No engine noise, no rotor wash, nothing. Just those 3 pulsing orbs moving through the night sky, and then they stopped. They hovered over the lake, maybe 100 yards from where we stood, arranged in a perfect triangle. The pulsing slowed, the lights growing brighter and then dimmer in a rhythmic pattern that reminded me of breathing. We didn't move, we barely breathed. We just stood there in the firelight, staring up at these impossible things hanging in the sky above us. Tyler's radio went dead. Not static, just silence, like someone had cut the power. The sudden absence of sound was jarring, and in that moment, I became aware of how quiet everything had become. The wind had stopped. The fire had stopped crackling, the flames frozen in place like a photograph. Even our breathing seemed muted, swallowed by the vast emptiness around us. The lights began to descend. They moved slowly, deliberately, dropping toward the ice in perfect synchronization. I wanted to run, wanted to jump in the truck and get the hell out of there, but I couldn't move. None of us could. We just stood there, transfixed, as the lights came down and down until they were maybe 20 feet above the ice. Close enough that I could see they weren't solid. They seemed to be made of light itself, pulsing and shifting, with no clear edges or boundaries. And then they touched down. The moment they made contact with the ice, they went dark. Not gradually, instantly, like someone had flipped a switch. 1 second they were there, bright enough to hurt my eyes, and the next there was nothing but darkness and the faint glow of our dying fire. The silence that followed was absolute. I've never experienced anything like it before or since. It wasn't just quiet, it was the absence of sound itself, like we'd been dropped into a vacuum. I couldn't hear the wind or the fire or my own heartbeat. I couldn't even hear Tyler and Jesse breathing beside me, though I could see the fog of their breath in the cold air. And then we heard the footsteps. They were slow and deliberate, the sound of bare feet walking on ice. Not the crunch of boots or shoes, but the soft slap of skin on frozen water. The sound came from where the lights had landed, from that patch of darkness about 100 yards away. We couldn't see anything, the fire had died down to embers, and the moonlight was too faint, but we could hear them clearly. Footsteps, multiple sets, moving toward us. "Get in the truck," Jesse whispered, his voice cracking with fear. "Get in the truck right now." That broke the spell. We ran, slipping and sliding on the ice in our winter boots, abandoning the fire and the beer and everything else. Tyler fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking so badly, he dropped them twice before he got the door open. We threw ourselves inside, and Tyler started the engine, the sound impossibly loud in the silence. The headlights came on, sweeping across the ice. And for just a second, I saw them. Figures, standing where the lights had been. 3 of them, I think. Though it was hard to tell because they were so far away, and the light was so poor. They were the right size and shape to be human, but something about them was wrong. They stood too still, too perfectly motionless, and even from that distance, I could tell they were naked, on ice. In 30 below weather, Tyler threw the truck into reverse, and we tore away from that place, the tires spinning on the ice before they found purchase. I kept my eyes on the side mirror, watching those figures recede into the darkness, watching for any sign of movement. But they just stood there, 3 dark shapes against the white expanse of the lake, perfectly still. None of us said a word on the drive home. Tyler dropped Jesse off first, then me, and we still hadn't spoken. What was there to say? We'd all seen it. We all knew it had happened. But none of us wanted to acknowledge it out loud, because that would make it real. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the house settle and creak around me, thinking about those lights and the silence and the footsteps on the ice. When morning finally came, I found my dad in the kitchen, drinking coffee and reading the paper. "Dad," I said, "can you drive me out to the lake? I need to pick up some stuff we left out there last night." He didn't ask questions, just grabbed his coat and keys. Tyler and Jesse were already there when we arrived, standing near Tyler's truck, staring out at the ice. My dad stayed by the truck while the 4 of us walked out to where we'd built the fire. The ashes were still there, scattered across the ice. Our beer cans were there too, half buried in the snow. Everything was exactly as we'd left it, except for one thing. Where the lights had landed, there were depressions in the ice. 3 of them, arranged in a triangle, each one maybe 6 feet across and several inches deep. The ice around them was smooth and clear, no cracks or fractures, like something incredibly heavy had simply pressed down and left its mark. And leading away from the depressions, heading toward the shore, were footprints, bare human footprints in the snow. I knelt beside them and saw the individual toe marks, the arch of the foot, every detail perfectly preserved. They were fresh made sometime during the night, but it had been 30 below. No one could walk barefoot in that temperature. The flesh would freeze and die within minutes. My dad came up behind us and looked at the prints without saying anything. He was a practical man, not given to wild speculation or ghost stories. But even he couldn't explain this. "You boys get in a fight with someone?" he finally asked. "No, sir," Tyler said. "We didn't see anyone. We saw some lights and got spooked and left." My dad looked at the depressions, then at the footprints, then back at us. "Get your stuff and let's go," he said. "And don't come out here at night anymore." We never talked about it again, the 4 of us. It became one of those things that existed in the space between what we knew and what we could accept. Too strange to explain, but too real to dismiss. Tyler moved away after graduation, joined the Army, and I haven't spoken to him in years. Jesse stayed in town, took over his dad's farm, and the one time I tried to bring it up, he changed the subject so fast I knew better than to push. But I still think about it. I think about those lights descending onto the ice, about the absolute silence that followed, about the sound of footsteps in the darkness. I think about those depressions and the footprints leading away into the snow. And sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I wonder what would have happened if we hadn't run, if we'd stayed by that fire and waited to see what came walking out of the darkness toward us. I moved away from Saskatchewan years ago, left the prairie and the long winters and the endless sky. But every January, when the cold settles in and the lakes freeze over, I find myself thinking about that night. I think about those 3 lights hovering over the ice, pulsing like something alive. And I think about the figures we saw standing in our headlights, perfectly still, perfectly naked, perfectly impossible in that killing cold. I've tried to find explanations over the years. Military exercises, ball lightning, mass hallucination brought on by the cold and the beer, but none of them fit. None of them explain the footprints or the depressions or the silence that swallowed everything. Sometimes I wonder if they're still out there, those lights. If they come back to that frozen lake on cold January nights, descending onto the ice and leaving their marks behind, and I wonder if there are other people out there who've seen them, who've heard those footsteps in the darkness, who carry the same questions I do. But mostly, I just try not to think about it, because when I do, when I really let myself remember that night in detail, I can still feel it, that absolute silence, that sense of something wrong and alien and utterly indifferent to our existence. And I remember the way those figures stood in the headlights, motionless and watching, and I know with absolute certainty that whatever they weren't human. And they're still out there, somewhere, under the frozen sky. I spent 5 harvest seasons driving grain trucks across Saskatchewan, hauling wheat and canola from farms to grain elevators, covering hundreds of kilometers on empty highways that stretched straight as arrows across the prairie. The work was long and monotonous, but the pay was good, and I didn't mind the solitude. Most of the driving happened at night when the roads were empty, and you could make good time without worrying about traffic or road construction. I'd leave one small town around sunset and arrive at another just before dawn, the landscape invisible in the darkness, except for the occasional yard light marking a distant farmstead. Highway 6 was one of my regular routes, running north-south through some of the most isolated country in the province. During the day, you could see for miles in every direction flat fields broken only by shelter belts and the occasional abandoned farmhouse. At night, it was different. The darkness was absolute, broken only by your headlights and the stars overhead. You could drive for an hour without seeing another vehicle, without seeing any sign of human habitation at all. It was late September, near the end of harvest, when I made the drive that changed everything. I'd loaded up in a town called Davidson around 10 at night and was heading north with a full load. The truck was running well, the road was clear, and I'd made this run so many times I could almost do it with my eyes closed. I had the radio on low, some late-night talk show out of Regina, and I was drinking gas station coffee to stay awake. Around 2 in the morning, I crested a small rise and saw lights ahead. That wasn't unusual. Farmers often worked late during harvest, running their combines through the night when the dew was off the crops. But as I got closer, I realized the lights weren't from machinery. They were coming from a house. Every window in the place was blazing with light. Not just a few rooms, but every single window, upstairs and down, glowing bright yellow against the darkness. I could see it from maybe half a mile away, standing alone beside the highway, surrounded by fields that looked dark and overgrown even in the limited visibility. I started to slow down without really thinking about it. Something about the house caught my attention, made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. As I got closer, I could see it more clearly in my headlights. It was old, really old, probably built in the early 1900s. A 2-story farmhouse with a steep roof and a wraparound porch, the kind you see in old photographs of homesteading families. The paint was peeling, hanging off the clapboard siding in long strips. The porch was sagging, the steps rotted through. The yard was overgrown with weeds and prairie grass that came up past the first-floor windows. But every light was on. Every single window glowed with warm yellow light, like there was a celebration happening inside, like the whole family was home and awake at 2 in the morning. I slowed to maybe 30 kilometers an hour as I approached, my eyes fixed on those lit windows. The fields around the house were dark and wild, clearly unworked for years. There were no vehicles in the yard, no machinery, no signs of life except for those lights. And then I saw them. Figures in the windows, in every window, standing perfectly still, facing out toward the road. I could see them clearly as I drew level with the house, men, women, children, all of them just standing there, motionless, their faces pale in the window light. They weren't looking at each other or moving around. They were all facing the same direction, facing the road, facing me. I felt my foot hit the gas before my brain had fully processed what I was seeing. The truck lurched forward, the engine roaring, and I focused on the road ahead, on the white line disappearing under my bumper. My hands were gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles had gone white. I didn't look in the rearview mirror. I didn't want to see if those lights were still visible behind me, if those figures were still standing in the windows, watching my truck disappear into the darkness. I drove for another hour before I stopped, pulling into an all-night truck stop near Saskatchewan. My hands were still shaking when I poured myself a cup of coffee in the dingy, fluorescent-lit restaurant. I sat in a booth by the window and tried to convince myself I'd imagined it, That exhaustion and the late hour had made me see things that weren't there. But I knew what I'd seen. Those figures in the windows. That old decrepit house surrounded by unworked fields, every light burning bright in the middle of the night. I made my delivery in Saskatoon and drove back to the depot in Davidson around noon the next day. I didn't mention what I'd seen to anyone at first. Who would believe me? But it gnawed at me, wouldn't let me rest. Finally, when I was dropping off my paperwork, I asked the dispatcher about it. "You know that stretch of Highway 6, about halfway between Davidson and Saskatoon?" I said, trying to sound casual. "There a farmhouse out there? Old place, 2 stories, right beside the road?" He looked up from his computer, and I saw something change in his expression. "Where exactly?" I described the location as best I could, estimated the kilometer marker based on how long I'd been driving. He was quiet for a long moment, just looking at me with this strange, troubled expression. "There's no farmhouse there," he finally said. "I saw it," I insisted. "Last night around 2, every light in the place was on." He shook his head slowly. "There was a farmhouse there, long time ago, but it burned down in the 80s. Whole family died, husband, wife, 3 kids. House burned so hot there was nothing left but the foundation. They bulldozed what was left and the land went back to the province. There's nothing there now, just fields." I felt something cold settle in my stomach. "I saw a house. I'm telling you, I saw it." "You're not the first," he said quietly. "Other drivers have mentioned it over the years, always at night, always the same description, every light on, figures in the windows. But it's not there, man. During the day, if you go look, there's nothing, just empty fields." He turned back to his computer, and I could tell the conversation was over. But as I was leaving, he called out to me, "Do yourself a favor. If you have to make that run, do it during the day. Don't drive that stretch at night anymore." I should have listened to him. I should have requested different routes, should have told them I wouldn't drive Highway 6 after dark. But I was stubborn, and I was proud, and some part of me wanted to prove that what I'd seen was real, that I hadn't imagined it. So I kept taking the night runs, and I never saw the house again. Not directly anyway. But sometimes, when I was driving that stretch of highway in the dark, I'd see lights in my rearview mirror. Not headlights from another vehicle. I knew what those looked like. These were different, softer, yellower, like lamplight from windows. They'd appear suddenly, maybe half a mile back, and stay there for a few minutes before fading away. And whenever I saw them, I'd feel that same cold dread settle over me, the same certainty that something was watching me from those lit windows. I did drive that route during the day a few times, made a point of it. I watched for the place where I'd seen the house, looked for any sign of old foundations or cleared land. But the dispatcher was right, there was nothing. Just fields and fence lines and the occasional abandoned grain bin. No house, no foundation, nothing to indicate a family had ever lived there. I asked around after that, talked to some of the old-timers who'd been driving these routes for decades. A few of them had heard the story. The family name was Morrison, they said. The fire happened in 1984, middle of winter. The whole family was home, John Morrison, his wife Sarah, and their 3 kids, ages 5 to 12. The fire started in the middle of the night, some kind of electrical fault. By the time anyone saw the flames, it was too late. The house was an inferno. All 5 of them died inside. They said John Morrison had been a hard man, kept to himself, didn't get along with the neighbors. There were rumors of trouble in the house, of his wife trying to leave and him not letting her. But they were just rumors. All anyone knew for sure was that the family died together in that fire, and the house burned until there was nothing left. I finished out that harvest season, and then I quit. Told the company I was moving on to other work, didn't mention the real reason. I couldn't shake the image of those figures in the windows, all of them standing still and silent, staring out at the road, staring at me. The way they'd been perfectly motionless, not the natural stillness of people looking out a window, but the frozen stillness of something wrong, something that shouldn't be. I've had other jobs since then, lived in different provinces, tried to put Saskatchewan and those empty highways behind me. But I still think about that night. I think about that house blazing with light in the middle of nowhere, about those figures arranged in every window like a grotesque tableau, and I think about what the dispatcher said, that other drivers had seen it too. Over the years, always the same description. The worst part isn't what I saw. The worst part is wondering about the Morrisons, about whether they're still there, somehow, trapped in that house that burned down 30 years ago. About whether they're trying to get someone's attention, trying to signal for help from windows that don't exist anymore, or about whether they're doing something else entirely, waiting, watching, drawing people's attention for reasons I don't want to think about. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd stopped that night. If I'd pulled over and walked up to that house, up those rotted porch steps, and knocked on the door, would it have opened? Would I have seen what was really inside, standing in all those lit rooms, staring out with pale faces? I'm glad I didn't stop. I'm glad I hit the gas and drove away. But part of me knows it doesn't matter, because I carry that image with me wherever I go. Those figures in the windows, that house burning with light, the certainty that they saw me, that they knew I was there, and that somewhere out on Highway 6, in the darkest hours of the night, they're still standing in those windows, still watching the road, still waiting for someone to stop. I don't drive at night anymore if I can help it. And when I do, when I'm on some dark highway with nothing but prairie stretching away on either side, I keep my eyes on the road ahead. I don't look in the rearview mirror. I don't want to see those yellow lights glowing in the distance behind me. I don't want to know if they're still there, still watching. Because some part of me is terrified that one night, I'll look in that mirror and see more than just lights. I'll see the house itself, closer than it should be, right behind me on that empty highway. And in every window, those figures will be staring out, staring at me, their faces pressed against the glass, waiting for me to stop. I took the job at the grain elevator in Chamberlain because I needed the money and didn't have many options. The town was dying, had been dying for decades, really ever since the railroad moved its operations to a larger hub 50 miles south. The population had dwindled from over 1,000 in the 50s to barely 200 by the time I arrived. Most of the businesses on Main Street were boarded up, and the grain elevator was one of the few places still employing people, though even that was on borrowed time. The elevator itself was a relic from another era, built in the 1920s when Chamberlain was still a thriving agricultural community. It was a massive wooden structure that loomed over the town like a sentinel, visible for miles across the flat prairie. The thing creaked and groaned constantly, the old timbers settling and shifting with changes in temperature and humidity. The locals all had stories about it, said it was haunted, said you could hear voices in the upper levels, said people had died there over the years in accidents that were never properly investigated. I didn't believe in ghosts. I was 23, pragmatic, and dismissive of small-town superstitions. The elevator was just an old building, and the sounds people heard were just the normal noises of aging wood and metal. That's what I told myself, anyway. I'd been working there for about 3 months when it happened. It was late October, that time of year when the days get short and the cold starts to settle in for real. Most of the harvest was done, but we were still processing grain from the few remaining farms in the area. I'd volunteered to work late that evening, doing inventory in the upper storage bins. The extra hours meant extra pay, and I needed every dollar I could get. My supervisor, a grizzled man named Dale, who'd worked at the elevator for 40 years, had looked at me strangely when I offered to stay. "You sure you want to be up there alone after dark?" he'd asked. "I'll be fine," I'd said, thinking he was worried about safety, about me falling or getting hurt with no one around to help. He'd nodded slowly, but something in his expression suggested he'd been worried about something else entirely. By 6 o'clock, everyone else had left, and I was alone in the building. The office lights were off, and the only illumination came from the work lights strung up in the upper levels where I was doing inventory. I had a clipboard and a flashlight, and I moved methodically through the storage bins, counting sacks and checking manifests. The work was tedious but not difficult, and I settled into a rhythm, my mind wandering as I worked. The elevator creaked and groaned around me, the sounds so constant I'd learned to tune them out. Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the metal siding and whistling through gaps in the structure. I was maybe 2 hours into the inventory, working in one of the bins on the 4th level, when I heard it, crying. It was faint at first, so faint I thought I might be imagining it, but I stopped what I was doing and listened, holding my breath, and there it was again, a child crying. Not loud, not hysterical, but steady and heartbroken, the kind of crying that comes from deep despair. The sound echoed through the metal structure, making it hard to pinpoint where it was coming from. I stood there in the dim work light, my heart starting to beat faster, telling myself there had to be an explanation. Maybe it was the wind. Maybe it was some kind of animal that had gotten into the building. Maybe it was coming from outside, from one of the few houses still occupied in town. But I knew it wasn't any of those things. The sound was too clear, too distinctly human. A child was crying somewhere in this building. I grabbed my flashlight and left the storage bin, walking out onto the catwalk that ran along the 4th level. The crying continued, echoing through the vast interior of the elevator. I stood there listening, trying to determine which direction it was coming from. And as I listened, it grew louder. Not much, but enough that I could tell it was coming from below me, from the lower levels. I should have left. I should have walked straight to my car and driven away, and called Dale to tell him there was something wrong in the building. But I didn't. Some combination of curiosity and concern drove me forward. If there was really a child in here, crying and alone, I needed to help them. I made my way to the metal stairs and started descending, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The elevator had 7 levels, and the storage bins got older and less used the farther down you went. We rarely stored grain below the 3rd level anymore, and the bottom 2 levels were mostly just used for equipment, storage, and maintenance access. The crying grew louder as I descended, echoing off the metal walls and wooden support beams. It was definitely coming from the lowest level, from the original part of the structure that dated back to the 20s. I reached the ground floor and paused, listening. The sound was clearer now, though still muffled, like it was coming from behind something. I walked through the main floor, past the loading dock and the office, and found the stairs that led down to the basement level. The stairs were old wood, worn smooth by decades of use, and they creaked loudly under my weight. The basement was cramped and dark, the ceiling low enough that I had to duck my head to avoid the overhead beams. The air down here was thick with dust and the smell of old grain and motor oil. The crying was loud now, close. I swept my flashlight around, illuminating ancient machinery covered in grime, stacks of wooden pallets, piles of tools and parts that hadn't been touched in decades. And then I saw a door at the far end of the basement, set into the concrete wall. It was metal, old and rusted, with a sign that read, "Maintenance, do not enter." The crying was coming from behind that door. I walked toward it slowly, my hand shaking enough that the flashlight beam wavered. The crying continued, steady and heartbroken, and I could hear the raw desperation in it now. Whoever was behind that door was terrified. I reached the door and tried the handle. It was locked, the metal cold under my palm. I pressed my ear against the door, listening. The crying stopped. The sudden silence was somehow worse than the sound had been. I stood there, my ear against the cold metal, barely breathing. And then I heard it, breathing. Small, rapid breaths, like a child who'd been crying so hard they could barely catch their breath. The breathing was right on the other side of the door, inches from my ear, close enough that I could hear the slight whistle of air moving through a small nose. "Hello?" I said, my voice cracking. "Are you okay? How did you get in there?" The breathing continued, but there was no response. No words, no movement. Just those small, frightened breaths. I pulled back from the door and looked at the lock. It was old, a heavy padlock that looked like it had been there for decades. There was no way a child could have locked themselves in from the outside, and there was no other entrance to that room that I could see. "I'm going to get help," I called through the door. "I'm going to find a key and get you out, okay? Just hang on." I backed away from the door, my eyes fixed on it, half expecting it to burst open. But nothing happened. The breathing continued for a few more seconds, and then it stopped. The silence that followed was absolute. I ran. I climbed those stairs 2 at a time, and didn't stop until I was outside in the cold October air, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I got in my car and sat there with the doors locked, staring at the dark bulk of the elevator, trying to process what I'd just experienced. I should have called the police, should have called Dale, but what would I tell them? That I'd heard a child crying in a locked room in the basement? They'd think I was crazy. I almost thought I was crazy. I went home and didn't sleep. I kept hearing that crying, those desperate, frightened breaths on the other side of the door. When morning came, I called Dale and told him I needed to ask him about something at work. We met at the elevator around 9. I took him down to the basement and showed him the locked door. He looked at it for a long time without saying anything, his face grave. "You heard something in there," he finally said. It wasn't a question. "Crying," I said. "A child crying and breathing, right on the other side of the door." Dale nodded slowly, like this was exactly what he'd been afraid of. "That room's been sealed since 1947, he said. It's not used for anything. Hasn't been opened in almost 80 years. Why? I asked. What happened? He was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was low. There was a worker here, back in the 40s. Name was Robert Chen. He had a son, maybe 7 or 8 years old. The boy used to come to work with his dad sometimes, play around the elevator while his father worked. One day, the kid wandered down here to the basement, got curious about what was in the maintenance room, went inside to look around. Dale paused, and I could see the weight of the story in his expression. The door locked behind him, he continued. Heavy spring mechanism, designed to close automatically. The boy couldn't get out, couldn't reach the handle from the inside. His father didn't know where he was, thought he'd gone home. Nobody heard him calling for help. The room was soundproof, built that way because of the machinery. By the time they found him 3 days later, he was dead, suffocated. I felt sick. Jesus Christ. Robert blamed himself, quit that same day, moved away. The company sealed the room, said it was too dangerous. Nobody's been in there since, but people hear things, especially at night, especially when they're alone in the building, crying, calling for help, the sound of small fists pounding on the door. I looked at the rusted padlock, at the faded warning sign. You knew this might happen. That's why you asked if I wanted to work late alone. I hoped it wouldn't, Dale said. Not everyone hears it. Some people work here for years and never experience anything, but some do. And once you've heard it, you can't unhear it. I quit 2 days later. Told Dale I'd found other work, which was a lie. I just couldn't be in that building anymore. Couldn't walk past that basement door, knowing what was behind it, knowing that somewhere in that sealed room, something was still crying out for help that would never come. I left Chamberlain shortly after that, moved to Regina, and found work in a warehouse. But I still think about that night. I think about that child, trapped in the dark, calling for his father, slowly suffocating as the air ran out. I think about those small, frightened breaths I heard through the door, so close and so real. And sometimes, late at night when I'm alone, I hear it again, faint and distant, like it's coming from very far away, a child crying. And I wonder if it ever stops, or if that sound will echo through that old grain elevator forever, a testimony to a tragedy that should never have happened, trapped behind a door that will never open. I lived in Mortlach for 3 years, working at a grain processing plant about 20 kilometers outside of town. Mortlach wasn't much population, hovering around 200, most of them farmers or retirees who'd been there their whole lives. One main street with a gas station, a post office, and a general store that doubled as a cafe, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, and strangers were noticed immediately. The town had one bus stop, a small shelter on the edge of town where Highway 2 curved past the old grain elevator. A Greyhound came through twice a week, picking up passengers heading to Moose Jaw or Regina. I drove past that bus stop every morning on my way to work, usually around 6:30 when the sun was just starting to come up in winter, painting the prairie sky in shades of pink and gray. I first saw her in early January, maybe 2 weeks after New Year's. The temperature had dropped to -30 overnight, cold enough that my truck took 3 tries to start, cold enough that the inside of my windows had frosted over despite the heater running full blast. As I drove past the bus stop, I noticed someone standing there, a woman, alone, waiting in the shelter. That wasn't unusual. People did occasionally take the bus out of Mortlach, though not often. What caught my attention was what she was wearing. Just a thin dress, pale blue or gray in the dawn light. Nothing that would protect anyone from the killing cold. No coat, no hat. Her hair hung loose around her face, long and dark, moving slightly in the wind that cut across the open prairie. I thought about stopping, about asking if she was okay, or if she needed a ride somewhere warmer. But I was running late, and I told myself the bus would be along soon, that she probably lived nearby and had just stepped out to wait. So I drove past, watching her in my rearview mirror until she disappeared from view. I saw her again 2 days later. Same spot, same dress, same posture, standing just inside the shelter, facing the road. The bus didn't come on Thursdays, only Tuesdays and Saturdays, which meant she wasn't waiting for a bus. She was just standing there, in the cold. This time I slowed down as I passed, getting a better look at her. She didn't move, didn't shift her weight or pull her dress tighter against the wind. She just stood there, perfectly still, staring down the empty highway. Her face was pale, so pale it seemed to catch what little light there was, and her features were indistinct at that distance. But I got the impression she was young, maybe in her 20s or 30s. I kept seeing her after that. Every morning when I drove to work, she was there, always in the same spot, always wearing that thin dress, regardless of the temperature. Some mornings it was -20. Some mornings the wind was so strong it rocked my truck. But she was always there, standing in that bus shelter, staring down the road. After about 3 weeks of this, I started to get worried. It wasn't normal. No one could stand outside in that kind of cold wearing just a dress, not for hours at a time. She should have been suffering from hypothermia, frostbite, should have been dead. But there she was, morning after morning, perfectly still and perfectly strange. I asked about her at the cafe one morning, casually mentioning to the owner a woman named Doris, who'd lived in Mortlock her entire life, that I'd been seeing someone waiting at the bus stop. "Bus stop?" Doris said, frowning. "Nobody uses that stop anymore. Bus comes through, but it hasn't picked anyone up from Mortlock in probably 6 months. "There's a woman there," I said. "I see her every morning, young, wearing a light-colored dress." Doris looked at me strangely. "I don't know who you're talking about. You sure you're not seeing things? Those early mornings, the light can play tricks on you." I insisted I'd seen her, described her again. But Doris just shook her head and changed the subject, and I got the sense she thought I was either mistaken or pulling her leg. I asked a few other people around town over the next week. The postmaster, the mechanic at the gas station, a couple of farmers who came into the plant. None of them had seen her. None of them knew of any woman in town who matched that description. One of the farmers suggested I might be seeing someone from one of the outlying farms, someone walking along the highway. But I knew what I'd seen. She wasn't walking. She was standing in that bus shelter, always in the exact same spot. Finally, I asked the bus driver. He came through on a Saturday, and I waited at the gas station until he pulled in to refuel. I walked over and struck up a conversation, eventually working around to asking if he ever picked up passengers at the Mortlock stop. "Mortlock?" He thought about it, scratching his jaw. "Nah, nobody ever waits there. I slow down out of habit, but I haven't stopped in that town in months, maybe longer." "You never see anyone there? A woman in a dress?" He looked at me like I was crazy. "In this weather? I'd remember that. No, man. That stop's always empty when I go through." That bothered me more than anything else. The bus driver would have a clear view of the shelter when he drove past. If she was really there, he would have seen her, but he hadn't. I decided I needed to stop and confront her to figure out what was going on. So the next Monday morning, I left for work 15 minutes early, giving myself time. When I approached the bus stop and saw her there, standing in her usual spot, I slowed down and pulled over to the shoulder about 20 feet past the shelter. I left the engine running and got out, the cold hitting me like a physical blow. My breath crystallized instantly, and I could feel the moisture in my nose starting to freeze. I walked back toward the shelter, my boots crunching on the frozen gravel. She didn't turn to look at me as I approached, just kept staring down the highway, her face in profile. Now that I was closer, I could see more details. The dress was old-fashioned, like something from the 50s or 60s, with a fitted bodice and a skirt that fell to mid-calf. Her feet were bare feet on frozen ground in January in Saskatchewan. "Hey," I called out, my voice sounding strange in the early morning stillness. "Are you okay? Do you need help?" She turned to look at me then, and I felt my stomach drop. Her face was wrong. That's the only way I can describe it. It was too pale, so pale it was almost luminous, and too smooth, too perfect, like a porcelain mask. Her eyes were dark and empty, and they didn't blink. They just stared at me with no expression, no recognition, no humanity. "Are you okay?" I asked again, taking an involuntary step backward. "Do you need a ride somewhere? You're going to freeze out here." She didn't respond, didn't move, just stared at me with those empty eyes, her face completely still, no breath clouding in the cold air, no shivering, no sign of life except for that terrible, unblinking stare. I backed away toward my truck, unable to tear my eyes away from her. I'm going to call someone," I said, though I didn't know who I would call or what I would tell them. "Just stay here, okay?" She didn't acknowledge me, didn't move. I got back in my truck, my hands shaking as I put it in gear. As I pulled away, I looked in the rearview mirror. She had turned to face my direction, standing at the edge of the shelter, watching my truck disappear down the highway. I didn't call anyone. What would I have said? That there was a woman standing at the bus stop who didn't seem quite human? Who stood in -30 weather in bare feet and a thin dress without any sign of distress? They'd think I was losing my mind. But I kept seeing her. Every single morning for the rest of that winter and into spring, always in the same spot, always wearing that same dress, always staring down the highway with that expressionless face. I stopped trying to talk to anyone about her. I just drove past, trying not to look, trying to convince myself she wasn't really there. Then, in late April, she was gone. I drove past the bus stop one morning and it was empty. No woman, no figure in a dress, just the empty shelter and the highway stretching away across the greening prairie. I felt a wave of relief so strong it made me dizzy. She didn't come back. Not that week, not that month. I kept watching for her every morning, kept expecting to see her standing there, but the bus stop remained empty. Eventually, I started to relax, started to convince myself that whatever I'd seen was over, that I could move on and forget about it. I left Mortlach 2 years later, took a job in Regina, and moved to the city. I told myself I was ready for a change, that I wanted more opportunities, more people around. But the truth was, I couldn't stand driving past that bus stop anymore. Even though she was gone, even though the shelter was always empty, I couldn't shake the memory of her standing there, staring with those empty eyes. I don't go back to Mortlach often, but sometimes work takes me down Highway 2, and I have to drive through. And every single time, when I approach that bus stop, I slow down. I can't help it. I slow down and I look, really look, at that empty shelter. And sometimes, not every time, but sometimes I swear I can see her. Just a shadow in the shelter, a dark shape that might be a woman in a dress, standing in the same spot, staring down the highway, waiting for something that will never come. I tell myself it's my imagination, that my mind is playing tricks on me, filling in details that aren't there. But my hands always tighten on the steering wheel, and I always accelerate a little harder than I should, putting distance between myself and that place. Because deep down, I know she's still there. Maybe not visible to everyone, maybe not always visible even to me. But she's there, standing in that bus shelter in her thin dress and bare feet, waiting in the cold for a bus that never stops, staring down an empty highway, with eyes that see nothing and everything at once. And I wonder sometimes who she was. If she was ever real, ever human, if she's waiting for someone or something, or if she's just trapped there, repeating the same moment forever. I wonder if she remembers the living world, or if she's so far gone that all she knows is that bus shelter and that empty road and the endless, patient waiting. I'll never know. And honestly, I don't want to, because some questions are better left unasked, and some mysteries are better left unsolved. All I know is that the woman at the bus stop is still there, in Mortlach, on the edge of a dying town on the Saskatchewan prairie. Still waiting, still watching, still staring down that empty road with her pale, mask-like face and her dark, empty eyes. And I'm never stopping to ask her why. My uncle bought the Windsor Hotel in Swift Current for almost nothing at an estate auction, convinced he could renovate it and turn it into boutique accommodations for travelers passing through Saskatchewan. The place had been closed for 15 years, sitting empty and deteriorating while the town council argued about what to do with it. It was a beautiful building from the outside, 3 stories of red brick with ornate stonework, built in 1912 when Swift Current was still a booming railway town. But inside, it was a disaster. My uncle called me in May, asking if I wanted to make some money helping him clean the place out before the renovation crews arrived. I was between jobs and living in my parents' basement, so I agreed. I drove out to Swift Current on a Monday morning, and my uncle met me in front of the hotel with a ring of keys and an optimistic smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "It's worse than I thought," he admitted as we stood on the cracked sidewalk, looking up at the building. Several windows on the upper floors were broken, and I could see water stains running down the brick facade. But the structure's solid. Once we get it cleaned out and deal with the water damage, it'll be great. The front doors were chained shut, the glass covered in decades of grime. My uncle unlocked the chains and we pushed our way inside. The lobby was dim and musty, filled with the smell of mold and rotting carpet. The grand staircase that had once been the hotel's centerpiece was sagging dangerously, and chunks of plaster had fallen from the ceiling, littering the floor with white debris. We spent the first few days working on the main floor and the guest rooms on the second level, hauling out old furniture and mattresses, ripping up carpet, documenting the extent of the water damage. It was back-breaking work, and by the end of each day, I was covered in dust and grime. But my uncle paid well, and the work was straightforward enough. It wasn't until Thursday that we made our way down to the basement. The basement entrance was through a door behind what used to be the front desk, down a steep set of concrete stairs that descended into darkness. My uncle had brought industrial work lights, but even with them set up, the basement remained shadowy and oppressive. The ceiling was low, maybe 7 feet at most, supported by thick stone pillars. The floor was uneven concrete, cracked and pitted with age. The basement was a maze. Unlike the upper floors with their organized layout of rooms and hallways, down here it was a chaotic warren of small storage rooms, narrow corridors, and dead ends. The hotel had apparently used this space for everything: laundry, food storage, mechanical systems, staff quarters. Decades of junk had accumulated in the rooms: broken furniture, moldy boxes, old machinery rusted beyond recognition. The smell was overwhelming. Not just mold, but something deeper and more unpleasant. Decay and stagnant water, and something else I couldn't quite identify. The air was thick and cold, even though it was warm outside. I could see my breath in the beam of my flashlight. We worked systematically, clearing out room after room, hauling everything up the stairs and into a dumpster my uncle had rented. Most of it was just garbage, water damage beyond salvage. But occasionally, we'd find something interesting: old hotel registers, vintage bottles, photographs of the staff from decades ago. It was late afternoon when I found the corridor. I'd been working in what looked like an old storage room, pulling out rotted wooden crates, when I noticed a doorway partially hidden behind a collapsed shelving unit. I moved the shelves aside and found myself looking down a narrow hallway that extended back into darkness, beyond the reach of our work lights. "Uncle Mark," I called out, "there's another section back here." He came over and looked down the corridor, frowning. "That's not on the blueprints I got from the city." We stood there for a moment, and I felt an inexplicable reluctance to go any farther. The corridor was narrower than the others, the walls bare stone instead of brick. It looked older, like it might have been part of an earlier structure that predated the hotel. "Well, let's check it out," my uncle said, but I noticed he didn't immediately start walking. He was feeling it too, that sense that something about this space was wrong. We made our way down the corridor, our flashlights cutting through the darkness. The walls were damp, water seeping through the stone and running down in dark rivulets. Our footsteps echoed strangely, the sound seeming to come from all around us rather than from beneath our feet. The corridor ended at a door. It was wooden, swollen with moisture, with a rusted handle and no visible lock. I tried the handle and it didn't budge. The wood warped into the frame after years of dampness. "Probably just another storage room," my uncle said, but he made no move to help me open it. I stepped back and kicked at the door near the handle. The wood was soft and rotten, and on the third kick, it gave way with a wet, tearing sound. The door swung open, and a wave of cold air rushed out, carrying with it that smell I'd noticed before, now much stronger, sweet and rotten, like flowers left too long in stagnant water. I shined my flashlight into the room. It was small, maybe 8 feet by 8 feet, with stone walls and no windows. The floor was bare concrete, and the ceiling was just rough wooden joists disappearing into darkness above. The cold was intense, far colder than the rest of the basement, cold enough that I could see my breath in thick clouds. And in the center of the room was a chair. It was a simple wooden chair, old and worn, with a straight back and no arms. It was positioned facing the door, as if someone had carefully placed it there and sat down to wait. The wood was dark with age and moisture, but the chair looked solid, strangely untouched by the decay that had claimed everything else in the basement. My uncle came up behind me, and I heard his sharp intake of breath. "What the hell is this room?" I stepped inside, my flashlight beam sweeping across the stone walls. There was nothing else here. No shelves, no boxes, no indication of what the room had been used for. Just that chair, sitting in the exact center of the space. And on the seat of the chair was a photograph. It was a black and white photograph, faded and spotted with age, but still clearly visible. I picked it up with trembling hands and held it under my flashlight. The photograph showed this room. The same stone walls, the same bare floor, taken from approximately where I was standing. And sitting in the chair, facing the camera, was a woman. She was wearing old-fashioned clothing, a high-collared dress from maybe the 1920s or 1930s. Her hair was pulled back severely from her face, and her hands were folded in her lap. She was staring directly at the camera, her face expressionless. But her eyes were wrong. They were completely black. Not just the pupils, but the entire eye, as if someone had painted over them with ink. No whites, no iris, just solid black orbs staring out from that pale, expressionless face. I felt my stomach drop. I turned the photograph over with shaking hands. On the back, in faded ink, was written a date, the 3rd of November, 1931. "Let me see that," my uncle said, reaching for the photo. But as I turned to hand it to him, I caught movement in my peripheral vision. I looked back at the chair. For just a fraction of a second, so brief I couldn't be sure I'd really seen it, there was someone sitting there. A woman in old-fashioned clothing, her hands folded in her lap, her face turned toward me, those black eyes staring. Then there was nothing. Just the empty chair in the cold room. I dropped the photograph and backed out of the room so fast I nearly knocked my uncle over. "We need to leave," I said, my voice high and tight. "We need to get out of this room right now." My uncle must have seen something in my face because he didn't argue. We retreated back down the corridor, and I didn't stop moving until we were up the concrete stairs and back in the lobby, breathing hard in the dusty afternoon light. "What did you see?" my uncle asked. I told him about the woman in the chair, about the black eyes in the photograph. He listened without interrupting, his face growing pale. "We're sealing that room," he said finally. "Tomorrow morning, we're bringing down concrete blocks and we're walling off that corridor. We tell the renovation crew there's structural issues back there and it's not safe to access." "What about the photograph?" "Leave it. Leave everything. We don't touch anything in that room ever again." We didn't go back to the basement that day. The next morning, my uncle hired a mason and they spent the day building a wall across the entrance to the corridor, sealing it off completely. They worked fast, like they wanted to get it done and get out. I stayed upstairs, helping to clear out the second-floor rooms, but I could hear them working below, the sound of concrete blocks being stacked and mortared into place. When they finished, my uncle had them apply a fresh coat of plaster over the wall so it blended with the rest of the basement. If you didn't know that corridor had been there, you'd never guess. I worked for another week helping with the cleanup, but I never went back to the basement. I made excuses, found reasons to focus on the upper floors. My uncle didn't push me. I think he was relieved. The renovation took almost a year. The hotel reopened as a boutique inn, and according to my uncle, it's been successful. Travelers like the historic character, the original woodwork and stonework. The rooms are booked most weekends. But I've never stayed there. I've never even gone back to visit, because sometimes late at night I still see her, that woman in the chair, her face expressionless, her hands folded in her lap, those black eyes staring at me from across decades, from a small stone room that no longer exists as far as the world is concerned. I've tried to research the hotel's history, to find out who she was and what happened in that room, but the records are incomplete, and what little I've found has only raised more questions. There were rumors in the 1930s about the Windsor Hotel, about guests who checked in and were never seen again, about sounds coming from the basement late at night. But they were just rumors, dismissed by the authorities of the time. I found one newspaper article from November 1931, the same month and year written on the back of that photograph. It mentioned a woman who'd gone missing from the hotel, a guest whose belongings were found in her room, but who had vanished without a trace. The investigation went nowhere. She was never found. The article included a photograph of the missing woman. I recognized her immediately. The same severe hairstyle, the same high-collared dress, the same expressionless face. But in the newspaper photo, her eyes were normal, human eyes. Whatever happened to her in that room, whatever left her sitting in that chair staring at nothing, it changed her. And some part of her is still there, behind that sealed wall in the basement of the Windsor Hotel, sitting in the darkness, waiting. I wonder sometimes if future renovators will break through that wall, find that corridor, open that door. I wonder what they'll discover in that cold stone room. Will the chair still be there? Will the photograph still be sitting on the seat, showing that woman with her black eyes? Or will they find something worse? Will they find her still sitting there, after all these years, her hands folded in her lap, her face turned toward the door, waiting for someone to finally ask her what happened in November of 1931? I don't know, and I never want to find out. My grandmother's farm sat on the edge of the prairie outside Outlook, Saskatchewan, a solitary white farmhouse surrounded by wheat fields that stretched to the horizon in every direction. I spent part of every summer there from the time I was 8 until I was 17, helping her with chores and keeping her company after my grandfather died. She was a tough woman, practical and unsentimental, shaped by decades of hard prairie winters and the kind of isolated farm life that either made you strong or broke you. She didn't complain, didn't ask for help she didn't need, and she certainly didn't believe in nonsense. Which is why what she told me that night has stayed with me all these years. The farmhouse was old, built in 1907 by my great-grandparents when they first homesteaded the land. It was a simple two-story structure with a wraparound porch and a steep roof designed to shed snow. The rooms were small and drafty. The floors creaked with every step, and in winter you could see your breath even with the furnace running. But it was solid, built to last, and my grandmother refused every suggestion that she sell it and move into town. Out back, maybe 50 yards from the house, was the storm cellar. It was a concrete bunker half buried in the ground, with heavy wooden doors that opened upward on rusted hinges. My grandmother used it to store preserves and root vegetables, and it doubled as a tornado shelter, though tornadoes were rare that far north. The cellar had been there as long as the house. Maybe longer. My grandfather thought it might have been built by whoever owned the land before my great-grandparents, back when the prairie was still being settled. I hated that cellar from the first time I saw it. There was something wrong about it, something that made my skin crawl even as a child. The entrance was a narrow concrete stairway that descended into darkness, and the doors were so heavy I could barely lift them by myself. Inside, the cellar was larger than you'd expect, maybe 15 feet by 20, with shelves lining the walls and a dirt floor that was always damp no matter how dry the weather. The air down there was thick and cold, and it smelled like earth and decay, and something else I could never quite identify, something old and sour. My grandmother would send me down there to fetch jars of pickles or preserves, and I would do it as quickly as possible, grabbing what I needed and scrambling back up those concrete steps into the sunlight. I never stayed down there longer than I had to, and I never went down after dark if I could avoid it. It was mid-July, and I'd been at the farm for about 2 weeks. I was 15 that summer, old enough to be useful with the harder chores, but still young enough that my grandmother worried about me being alone too long. The days were long and hot, and I'd fall into bed exhausted each night, sleeping deeply in the small upstairs bedroom that had been my grandfather's office before he died. I woke suddenly in the darkness, disoriented and unsure what had pulled me from sleep. The room was pitch black. My grandmother lived far enough from town that there were no streetlights, no ambient glow from anything except the stars. I lay there listening, my heart beating faster than it should, trying to figure out what had woken me. Then I heard it. 3 knocks. Slow, deliberate, evenly spaced. Then silence. I sat up in bed, straining to hear. The house was full of sounds at night, creaking wood, settling foundations, the wind against the windows. But this was different. This was purposeful. 3 more knocks. Same rhythm, same deliberate spacing. And I realized they were coming from outside. I got out of bed and went to the window, pressing my face against the glass. The prairie stretched away in all directions, silver gray under the starlight. There was nothing moving out there. No vehicles, no animals, no people. Just empty fields and the dark bulk of the barn, and, closer to the house, the low mound of the storm cellar. The knocking came again, and this time I was sure. It was coming from the cellar. 3 knocks, evenly spaced, echoing slightly in the still night air, then silence, then 3 more knocks. I stood at the window for a long time, watching the cellar doors. They didn't move. There was no light, no indication that anyone was down there. Just those 3 knocks, repeating every 30 seconds or so with mechanical precision. I should have gone back to bed, should have convinced myself it was just an animal or the wind or my imagination. But I was 15 and stupid, and I thought my grandmother should know that something was wrong. So I went downstairs. The stairs creaked under my feet, impossibly loud in the quiet house. I made my way through the dark living room to my grandmother's bedroom and knocked softly on her door. "Grandma, are you awake?" I heard movement inside, and then the door opened. My grandmother stood there in her nightgown, her gray hair loose around her shoulders. But what stopped me was her face. She looked frightened. My grandmother, who I'd seen face down aggressive bulls and winter blizzards with nothing but grim determination, looked genuinely afraid. "You heard it," she said. It wasn't a question. "The knocking from the cellar?" She nodded slowly and moved past me toward the kitchen. I followed her, and we stood together at the back window, looking out at the storm cellar. As we watched, the knocking came again. 3 deliberate knocks, perfectly timed, echoing across the yard. "How long has this been happening?" I asked. My grandmother was quiet for a long moment. When she finally spoke, her voice was low and strained. 5 years, since your grandfather died. It started maybe 2 months after the funeral. I heard it one night, just like you did. 3 knocks from the cellar. Did you go check?" "The first time, yes. I thought maybe an animal had gotten trapped down there, or something had fallen and was shifting in the wind. I took a flashlight and went down. There was nothing. No animal, nothing out of place. But while I was down there, the knocking stopped. As soon as I came back up and closed the doors, it started again." She paused, and I could see her hands trembling slightly as she gripped the windowsill. "The second time it happened, about a month later, I tried to ignore it, but it went on for hours. 3 knocks, over and over, all through the night. I couldn't sleep. Finally, around dawn, it stopped." "Have you told anyone?" "Who would I tell? The police? Your parents? They'd think I was losing my mind. Maybe I am." She looked at me, and I saw genuine uncertainty in her eyes. "But you heard it too, so either we're both crazy, or something is down there." The knocking came again, and we both flinched at the sound. "Grandma," I said carefully, "why do you think it's connected to Grandpa?" She turned away from the window and walked to the kitchen table, sitting down heavily in one of the wooden chairs. I sat across from her, waiting. "Your grandfather had a routine," she finally said. "Every day, when he came in from working the fields, he would knock on the door 3 times before coming inside. It was his signal, so I'd know it was him and not a stranger. 3 knocks, always the same rhythm. He did it for 40 years. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. The knocking sounds exactly like his knock. Same rhythm, same spacing, same everything." She looked up at me, and I saw tears in her eyes. "But it's not him. Your grandfather is dead. I watched them bury him. Whatever is knocking on that cellar door, it's not your grandfather." We sat in silence for a while, listening to the knocking continue outside. 3 knocks, pause, 3 knocks, pause, on and on, with mechanical precision. "Have you ever opened the doors while it's happening?" I asked. "No, and I never will." Her voice was firm on this point. "I learned a long time ago that some things are better left alone. Your grandfather is at peace. Whatever this is, it's something else. Something that learned his knock somehow. And I don't want to know what happens if I acknowledge it. Does it always stop eventually?" "Usually by dawn, sometimes sooner. It happens every few months, no pattern I can figure out. Sometimes 3 months will go by with nothing. Sometimes it's only a few weeks between episodes." The knocking continued, echoing through the night. We sat there in the dark kitchen, my grandmother and I, listening to that impossible sound. 3 knocks, over and over, from a concrete cellar that should have been empty. Eventually, maybe around 4 in the morning, the knocking stopped. One moment it was there, constant and rhythmic, and the next there was just silence. My grandmother and I looked at each other across the kitchen table. "Try to get some sleep," she said. "We've got chores in the morning." But neither of us slept. I went back upstairs and lay in bed, watching the sky gradually lighten through the window. When the sun finally rose, I got dressed and went downstairs to find my grandmother already in the kitchen, making breakfast like nothing had happened. We didn't talk about it. We did the morning chores, fed the chickens, checked the crops. The storm cellar sat there in the backyard, its heavy wooden doors closed, looking completely normal in the daylight. If I hadn't heard the knocking myself, I might have convinced myself the whole thing had been a dream. But it wasn't a dream. And over the next 2 weeks, it happened 3 more times. Always at night, always the same pattern, 3 deliberate knocks, repeating endlessly until dawn. My grandmother never opened the cellar doors during these episodes, and she wouldn't let me either. "Promise me," she said one morning after a particularly long night of knocking. "Promise me, you'll never open those doors at night, not while the knocking is happening, not ever." I promised. I left at the end of July to go back home, back to school and normal life. But I called my grandmother every week, and sometimes I'd work up the courage to ask if it had happened again. Sometimes she'd say yes, sometimes she'd change the subject, but I could always tell from her voice when she'd had a bad night. My grandmother lived alone on that farm for another 12 years before she finally agreed to move into a nursing home in town. She was 87 by then, too frail to manage the property anymore. My parents sold the farm to a young couple from Alberta, and I heard later that they were planning to renovate the house and modernize everything. I thought about calling them, about warning them about the cellar, but what would I say? That sometimes, late at night, something knocks on the storm cellar doors in the exact rhythm my dead grandfather used to use? That my grandmother believed something down there was mimicking him, trying to get someone to open those doors? They'd think I was insane. My grandmother died 2 years after moving into the nursing home. In her final weeks, when the morphine had her drifting in and out of consciousness, she would sometimes grip my hand and whisper urgently, "Don't let them open it, promise me, don't let them open the cellar." I don't know if the new owners have heard the knocking. I've never contacted them to ask, and I've never driven by the property. Some part of me doesn't want to know if it's still happening, if that thing, whatever it is still down there, still knocking on those heavy wooden doors with the same rhythm my grandfather used for 40 years. But sometimes, late at night, I think about that cellar. I think about the cold, damp air and the smell of earth and decay. I think about those 3 deliberate knocks echoing across the dark prairie. And I wonder what's really down there in that concrete bunker, half buried in the ground, waiting for someone to finally answer its knock. I'd been working late in Saskatoon, wrapping up a construction project that had run months over schedule, and it was past 11 when I finally got in my truck to head home. I lived in a small town about 2 hours south, and I'd made the drive so many times I could practically do it in my sleep. But that night I was tired, and the thought of dealing with semi-trucks and long-haul traffic on the highway made me decide to take the back roads instead. It would add maybe 20 minutes to the trip, but the roads would be empty, and I could drive at my own pace. I took Highway 11 south out of Saskatoon, then turned off onto a secondary highway that cut through farmland. The night was clear and moonless, the kind of darkness you only get on the prairie where there are no cities for miles, and the sky is filled with more stars than seem possible. My headlights carved a tunnel through the blackness, illuminating the gravel road and the ditches on either side. But beyond that, there was nothing but fields stretching away into invisibility. I'd been driving for maybe 40 minutes when I turned onto a road I'd taken dozens of times, before a straight gravel road that ran east-west for about 10 kilometers, before hitting an intersection where I'd turned south again. It was a boring stretch, perfectly flat, perfectly straight, with canola fields on both sides that would be bright yellow during the day, but were now just dark expanses of nothing. I settled into the drive, the truck's headlights steady on the road ahead, the radio playing quietly. The road was in good shape, recently graded, and I made good time. I was thinking about getting home, about the beer in my fridge and the bed waiting for me, when I realized something was wrong. I should have reached the intersection by now. I checked the odometer, doing quick math in my head. I'd been on this stretch for at least 15 kilometers, maybe more, but the road just kept going, straight and endless, disappearing into the darkness ahead. There was no intersection, no T-junction, just more gravel road stretching into the night. I slowed down, confused. I'd driven this route 100 times. I knew every turn, every landmark. This road was supposed to end at a T-intersection after 10 kilometers, but I'd gone 15, and there was still no sign of it. I pulled over to the side of the road and put the truck in park. The silence outside was absolute. No wind, no insects, no distant sounds of traffic or machinery, just emptiness. I pulled out my phone and opened the GPS app, waiting for it to load. The blue dot appeared, pulsing on the screen, showing my location. But when I zoomed out to see where I was, I felt my stomach drop. According to the GPS, I wasn't on a road. The blue dot was sitting in the middle of an empty field, miles from the nearest marked road. I zoomed in closer, thinking maybe the map just hadn't loaded properly, but there was nothing there. No road, no path, just agricultural land. I switched to satellite view, and the image showed the same thing: fields, no road, nothing that matched what I was actually seeing outside my windshield. "That's not right," I said aloud, my voice sounding strange in the confined space of the truck cab. I put the truck in reverse and backed up a few feet, watching the GPS. The blue dot moved with me, but it stayed floating in that empty field. According to my phone, I was driving through farmland that didn't have any roads. I sat there for a long moment, trying to make sense of it. GPS could be wrong sometimes, I knew that. Satellites glitched. Maps didn't always update, but I was on a physical road. I could see it in my headlights, feel the gravel under my tires. This road existed. I put the truck in drive and started forward again, deciding to keep going until I found that intersection. It had to be up ahead somewhere. Maybe I'd gotten turned around, taken a wrong turn I didn't remember. The road would end eventually, and I'd figure out where I was. I drove for another 10 kilometers, then 20. The road never changed. It stayed perfectly straight, perfectly flat, with the same fields on either side. No houses, no yard lights, no signs, no intersections. Just endless gravel road disappearing into my headlights. I checked my odometer again. I'd gone 35 kilometers on a road that should have only been 10 kilometers long. This was impossible. I tried calling my wife, but there was no signal, not even one bar. I tried again, then checked my messages, thinking maybe I'd at least have data, but there was nothing. My phone showed no connection at all. The gas gauge was getting lower. I'd had half a tank when I turned onto this road, but I'd been driving for over an hour now. If I didn't find my way back soon, I'd run out of fuel out here in the middle of nowhere. I decided to turn around. Whatever was happening, whatever mistake I'd made, the answer was back the way I'd come. I'd retrace my route to where I turned onto this road and start over. I slowed to a stop and performed a three-point turn, my headlights sweeping across the empty fields. For just a moment, as the beams swung across the landscape, I thought I saw something standing in the field. A dark shape, maybe human-sized, perfectly still. But when I completed the turn and the lights pointed back down the road, there was nothing there. I headed back the way I'd come, watching the odometer count down the kilometers. The road looked exactly the same in reverse straight gravel, empty fields, nothing to distinguish one section from another. I should have been seeing my tire tracks in the road, evidence of my passage, but the gravel looked undisturbed. I drove for what felt like an hour, maybe longer. The odometer showed I'd gone 50 kilometers, but I never reached the intersection where I'd originally turned onto this road. It never appeared. The road just kept going, straight and endless in both directions. I was starting to panic now, my hands gripping the steering wheel too tight, my breath coming faster. This didn't make sense. Roads didn't just go on forever. They had to end somewhere, had to connect to other roads, had to lead somewhere. But this one didn't. I pulled over again and turned off the engine, trying to calm down and think clearly. Maybe I was having some kind of medical episode, a stroke or a brain tumor, or something that was making me hallucinate, but everything else seemed normal. I felt fine, just confused and scared. I sat there in the darkness, and that's when I noticed it for the first time. The silence wasn't just the absence of sound, it was oppressive, heavy, like the air itself was absorbing every noise. When I shifted in my seat, the sound of fabric against leather seemed muffled and distant. When I cleared my throat, the sound died immediately instead of echoing in the small space, and there were no stars. I looked up through the windshield and realized the sky was completely black. Earlier, when I'd first gotten on the road, the sky had been filled with stars, that brilliant display you only get on the prairie. But now there was nothing, just absolute darkness above, as if something had extinguished every light in the universe. That's when I saw the headlights. They appeared in my rearview mirror, distant but unmistakable. 2 points of light approaching from behind me. I felt a surge of relief so intense I almost cried. Another vehicle, another person. I wasn't alone on this impossible road. I got out of my truck and stood beside it, waving my arms. The headlights grew closer, and I could hear the engine now, the sound of gravel crunching under tires. The vehicle slowed as it approached an old pickup truck, battered and dusty, driven by a man who looked to be in his 60s or 70s. He pulled up alongside me and rolled down his window. His face was drawn and exhausted, his eyes wide with fear that mirrored my own. "Thank God," he said. "I thought I was the only one. I've been driving this road for 45 minutes trying to find the highway. Where the hell are we?" "I don't know," I admitted. "I've been on this road for over an hour. It just keeps going. No intersections, no turnoffs, nothing." He nodded, as if this confirmed something he'd already suspected. "My GPS says I'm in the middle of a field, says there's no road here at all." "Mine too," I said. We stood there for a moment, two strangers in the darkness, both understanding that we were experiencing something that shouldn't be possible. "We should stick together," he said. "Drive in convoy. Maybe if we keep going, we'll find a way out." I agreed, and we got back in our vehicles. He took the lead, and I followed close behind, his taillights a red glow in the darkness ahead of me. We drove for what felt like another 30 minutes, maybe longer, the road unchanging beneath our wheels. And then, suddenly, there was an intersection. It appeared without warning, as if it had simply materialized in our headlights. A T-intersection, the road ending abruptly at a crossing road that ran north-south. We both stopped, and I got out to look at the signpost. There was no sign, just a wooden post with the brackets where signs should have been, but they were empty. The other driver got out of his truck and stood beside me. "Which way?" he asked. "I don't know. I don't recognize this intersection." "Me neither." He looked up and down the crossing road. "We need to pick one. We can't stay here." We both turned right, heading north. Almost immediately, I started seeing things that looked familiar. A grain elevator in the distance, the lights of what might be a town. The oppressive silence began to lift, and I could hear normal night sounds again: wind, insects, the distant rumble of a train. After another 20 minutes, we reached a highway I recognized. We pulled over at a gas station, and the other driver and I stood under the fluorescent lights, looking at each other. "What the hell was that?" I asked. "I don't know. I don't want to know." He looked old and tired, shaken in a way that went deeper than simple confusion. "I've lived in Saskatchewan my whole life, driven these roads for 50 years. I've never seen anything like that." We exchanged numbers, promised to call each other to make sure we both got home safely. But we never did call. I think we both wanted to forget it had ever happened. I've tried to find that road again. I've studied maps, driven the back roads, retraced my route as best I could remember it, but I've never found it. There's no gravel road in that area that matches my memory. No stretch of straight road that goes on longer than it should. But sometimes, late at night when I'm driving alone, I feel it. That sense that I'm about to turn onto a road that doesn't end. And I grip the steering wheel a little tighter, and I stay on the highways, and I try not to think about what might still be out there on the prairie, waiting. I grew up in a settlement so small it didn't even have a proper name. People called it the Crossroads, because that's all it was: two gravel roads intersecting in the middle of the Saskatchewan prairie, with maybe 8 or 10 houses clustered around them and a church. The church was the only thing that gave the place any identity. Everything important happened there: weddings, funerals, Sunday services, community meetings. If you lived within 20 miles, you went to that church. It was old, built in 1887 by the first settlers who'd homesteaded the area. They'd constructed it themselves from local stone and timber, and it showed in every crooked line and uneven surface. The building was small, maybe big enough to hold 50 people if everyone squeezed together, with a simple rectangular sanctuary, a basement for storage and Sunday school, and a small bell tower that hadn't held a bell for as long as anyone could remember. But there was something strange about that church, something I noticed even as a child. Sound didn't carry right inside it. When the congregation sang hymns, the music seemed muffled and distant, like it was being absorbed by the walls before it could properly resonate. When the pastor preached, his voice would boom for a moment and then seem to flatten out, losing its resonance in a way that made it hard to follow his words. People's footsteps on the wooden floors, which should have echoed in that small space, seemed to die immediately. My mother said the church had good acoustics for prayer, that the quietness helped people focus on God, but I always felt like the building was swallowing sound, eating it up and refusing to let it escape. I was 12 years old the Sunday it happened. It was late September, one of those cool fall days when you could smell winter coming on the wind. The service had been normal hymns, scripture reading, a sermon I barely paid attention to. Afterward, most people lingered in the small yard outside, talking and catching up, while a few of us stayed inside to help clean up and put things away. My mother was outside talking to the pastor, and I was inside alone, moving through the pews and collecting hymnals that had been left behind. The other volunteers had finished their tasks and drifted outside, their voices fading as they joined the conversations in the yard. I could see them through the windows, small groups of people standing in the autumn sunshine, and I could see their mouths moving, but I couldn't hear them. The glass was thick and old, and combined with the strange acoustics of the building, it created a barrier of silence. I was in the front pew, stacking hymnals, when I became aware of how quiet it was. Not just quiet, silent. Completely, utterly silent, in a way that made my ears ring. I straightened up and looked around. The sanctuary was empty except for me. I could still see people outside through the windows, but their conversations produced no sound. There was no wind, no creaking of the old building settling, no distant sounds of traffic or birds, nothing. And then I heard the footsteps. They came from below, from the basement. Slow, heavy footsteps, deliberate and measured, climbing the wooden stairs. I could hear each individual step creaking under weight. Could hear the rhythm of someone ascending step, step, pause, taking their time. I froze, the hymnal in my hands forgotten. The basement door was behind me, at the back of the sanctuary near the entrance. I'd walked past it 100 times. It was always kept locked during services, and I knew for certain it had been locked that morning. The pastor was particular about it, but I heard the door open. It was a distinctive sound, the old hinges squealing slightly, the click of the latch releasing, and then the footsteps continued, now on the wooden floor of the sanctuary itself. They were behind me, moving slowly across the back of the church, heading toward where I stood, frozen at the front. Step, pause, heavy footsteps, like someone wearing boots. A measured pace, unhurried, getting closer. I wanted to turn around, wanted to see who was there, but I couldn't move. Fear had locked my muscles in place, and all I could do was stand there, listening to those footsteps approach. The sound was clear and distinct in that silent building, each step echoing slightly before being absorbed by whatever quality made the church swallow sound. The footsteps were halfway down the center aisle now, maybe 20 feet behind me. I could hear them clearly, the heavy tread, the slight scrape of a boot heel, the creak of the floorboards under weight. Someone was walking toward me. Someone large and deliberate, taking their time. Step, pause. Closer now, maybe 10 feet behind me. I tried to move, tried to force my legs to run, but I couldn't. I could only stand there, my hands gripping the hymnal so tight my knuckles had gone white, my breath coming in small, shallow gasps. The footsteps stopped. They stopped directly behind me, close enough that if I turned around, whoever it was would be within arm's reach. I could feel a presence there, could sense something standing at my back, waiting. I don't know how long I stood like that. It felt like forever, but it was probably only a few seconds. And then, finally, I managed to move. I spun around, dropping the hymnal, my heart hammering in my chest. The sanctuary was empty. There was no one behind me, no one in the aisle, no one anywhere in the church. And the basement door was still closed, still locked, the old padlock hanging from the latch exactly as it had been all morning. I ran. I dropped everything and sprinted for the front doors, bursting out into the autumn sunshine. The sudden noise of the outside world was almost painful. After that absolute silence, people talking, wind in the trees, birds calling. My mother was standing with a group of women, and she looked up in surprise as I crashed through the doors. "What's wrong?" she asked, but I couldn't answer. I just shook my head and went to sit in our car, trying to slow my racing heart. I never told anyone what had happened. Who would believe me? I'd heard footsteps from an empty room, from a locked basement, from nothing at all. It sounded insane even to me. But I never volunteered to help clean up after service again. I never stayed in that church alone. And I started paying attention to things I'd previously ignored, the way people would sometimes pause in their conversations and glance toward the basement door, the way the pastor would occasionally stop mid-sermon and look toward the back of the sanctuary, as if he'd heard something, the way older members of the congregation avoided lingering inside after services ended. I started asking questions, carefully, casually, never revealing why I was curious. I asked my grandmother about the church's history, about the early settlers who'd built it. I asked the librarian in the nearest town if there were any records about the site. And slowly, piece by piece, I learned the truth. The church had been built in 1887, but the land it sat on was older than that, much older. When the first homesteaders arrived in the 1870s, they'd found markers there, rough stones arranged in patterns, depressions in the earth that suggested old graves. The settlers had assumed it was a native burial ground, though no one from the local Cree communities claimed it. They should have left it alone, should have built their church somewhere else. But land was precious, and the site was elevated slightly above the surrounding prairie. Good drainage, protected from the worst of the winter winds. So they cleared away the stones, filled in the depressions, and built their church. They told themselves they were doing God's work, bringing Christianity to the wilderness. They told themselves it didn't matter what had been there before. I found an old diary in the town library, written by one of the original settlers. He'd been part of the construction crew that built the church. In one entry, dated August 1887, he wrote about what they'd found when they dug the foundation. "We found bones," the entry said. "Human bones, dozens of them, all buried shallow in the earth. Old bones, ancient perhaps. We debated what to do. The pastor said we should rebury them properly, in consecrated ground. But there were so many, and we were behind schedule. In the end, we left them, covered them over with the foundation and the basement floor. No one will know. God will forgive us." But they didn't just find bones. The diary mentioned other things, artifacts they didn't understand, symbols carved into stones, evidence of ceremonies and rituals that predated European settlement by centuries. All of it was destroyed or buried beneath the church. I found another reference in a newspaper from 1903, a small article about the church. It mentioned that the congregation had complained about strange sounds in the building, footsteps when no one was there, voices in empty rooms, the sound of something moving in the basement. The pastor at the time had blamed it on the building settling, on wind and old wood. But the article noted that several families had stopped attending services, choosing to travel to a church in the next settlement rather than worship in that building. The more I learned, the worse I felt. That church was built on top of a cemetery, a sacred site, and the bodies had been left there, trapped beneath the foundation. And whatever had happened in that place before the settlers arrived, whatever rituals or ceremonies or burials had taken place, the church had violated it all. I moved away when I was 18, left for college, and never looked back. I haven't been to that settlement in over 20 years. I heard the church finally closed about 10 years ago, the congregation too small to maintain it. The building still stands, locked and empty, slowly falling apart. But sometimes, when I can't sleep, I think about that Sunday when I was 12. I think about those footsteps climbing up from the basement, crossing the sanctuary floor, stopping right behind me. I think about the absolute silence of that building, the way it swallowed sound like it was hungry for it. And I wonder what's still down there, beneath that locked basement door, beneath the foundation and the old wooden floor. I wonder about the bones the settlers covered over, the graves they violated, the sacred ground they desecrated in their arrogance. I wonder if those footsteps still echo through that empty church, climbing up from the basement, walking through the sanctuary, searching for something or someone. And I'm grateful I ran when I did, grateful I never turned around while those footsteps were right behind me. Because sometimes, late at night, I can't shake the feeling that if I had turned around, if I had seen what was standing there, I would never have been able to leave that church. I would still be there, standing in that silent sanctuary, listening to footsteps that never end, trapped in a building that sits on top of ground that should have been left alone. I moved to Holdfast in November, taking the only apartment I could afford on my grocery store wages. The town was barely more than a wide spot in the road population, maybe 300 on a good day, and cheap rent was one of the few advantages of living there. The apartment was on the second floor of an old building on Main Street, above what used to be a grocery store that had closed years before. The storefront windows were papered over, and the whole ground floor was empty and dark. But the apartment upstairs was livable, if barely. The landlord, a man named Gerald who owned several properties in town, met me with the keys and gave me a quick walkthrough. The apartment was small, just a kitchen, a living room, a bedroom, and a bathroom, but it was clean enough and the rent was cheap. He mentioned I'd be the only tenant in the building, that the grocery store space downstairs had been vacant since 2015, and he hadn't found anyone interested in leasing it. "You'll have the place to yourself," he said, like this was a selling point, nice and quiet. I moved in that same day, hauling my few possessions up the narrow staircase that led from the street entrance. The apartment was cold and drafty, the old windows letting in frigid air around the frames. The radiators clanked and hissed but barely produced heat. But I'd lived in worse places, and I told myself it would be fine once I got settled. The first few weeks were unremarkable. I worked at the grocery store in the next town over, a 20-minute drive, and came home to my cold apartment each night. The isolation didn't bother me much. I'd always been comfortable with solitude. and there was something almost peaceful about being alone in that old building, listening to it settle and creak around me. But the building made a lot of noise, especially at night. The floors would creak for no apparent reason, like someone was walking through the empty grocery store below. The pipes would clang and rattle. The wind would whistle through gaps I couldn't locate. Sometimes I'd hear what sounded like a door closing somewhere in the building, even though I was the only one there and all my doors were open. I told myself it was just an old building doing what old buildings do, nothing to worry about. It was mid-December when it happened. A Friday night, cold and clear, with temperatures well below freezing. I'd come home from work around 9, made myself dinner, and was washing dishes at the kitchen sink. The kitchen window looked out over the alley behind the building, and beyond that, a vacant lot covered in snow. There were no streetlights in the alley, and the window reflected the kitchen lights more than it showed anything outside. I was scrubbing a plate, my hands in the warm, soapy water, when I glanced up at the window, and I saw him. A man's face, pressed against the glass, staring at me. He was maybe 6 inches from the window, his features flattened slightly by the pressure of his face against the cold glass. His skin was pale, almost gray, and his eyes were wide and unblinking. He wasn't moving, wasn't breathing visible breaths in the cold air. He was just there, staring at me with those wide, motionless eyes. I screamed and jumped back from the sink, the plate slipping from my hands and shattering on the floor. My heart was hammering so hard I thought it might burst. I stood there, frozen, staring at that face in the window. It didn't move, didn't blink, didn't react to my scream at all, just kept staring with those terrible, empty eyes. I grabbed my phone from the counter with shaking hands and dialed 911, my eyes never leaving the window. The dispatcher answered and I tried to explain what was happening, my words coming out in a panicked rush. There's someone outside my window, a man. He's looking in at me. I'm on the 2nd floor. Are you in danger right now? The dispatcher asked calmly. I don't know. He's just staring at me. He's right outside the kitchen window. We're sending officers to your location. Can you move to a different room? I backed toward the kitchen doorway, still watching the window. I'm moving now. Good. Stay on the line with me. I retreated to my bedroom and locked the door, sitting on the bed with my phone pressed to my ear, listening to the dispatcher's calm voice telling me the police were on their way. My whole body was shaking. I kept seeing that face in my mind, the pale skin, the wide eyes, the way he'd been pressed right up against the glass like he was trying to get as close as possible. The police arrived within 10 minutes, their red and blue lights flashing through my bedroom window. I heard them knock on the street entrance, and I ran down to let them in. There were 2 officers, both local guys I'd seen around town. They asked me to describe what had happened, and I told them, trying to keep my voice steady. He was right at the kitchen window, looking in. His face was pressed against the glass. One of the officers went upstairs to check the apartment while the other went around back to examine the alley. I stood in the entrance hallway, hugging myself against the cold, waiting. They both came back within a few minutes, and I could tell from their expressions what they were going to say before they said it. Ma'am, there's no one out there, the first officer said. We checked the whole alley, and there are no footprints in the snow beneath your window. But I saw him, I insisted. He was right there. How high up is that window? The second officer asked. 2nd floor, maybe 12, 15 feet. There's no ladder, no way to reach it, and the snow under the window is undisturbed. If someone had been there, there would be prints. I followed them back upstairs, and we looked at the kitchen window together. When I got close to it, I could see they were right. There was nothing on the glass. No handprints, no smudge marks, no fog from breath. The window was perfectly clean except for a light coating of frost on the outside. Could it have been a reflection? One of the officers suggested gently. Sometimes reflections in windows can look like faces, especially at night. It wasn't a reflection, I said, but my voice was uncertain now. I saw him, clear as day. They stayed for a while longer, checking all the windows and doors, making sure the apartment was secure. They were kind about it, professional, but I could tell they thought I'd imagined it. Before they left, one of them gave me his card and told me to call if I saw anything else. After they were gone, I went back to the kitchen and stood in front of the window, trying to understand what I'd seen. The window was dark now, reflecting my own pale face back at me. Could it have been a reflection? Could I have somehow seen my own face and mistaken it for someone else's? But I knew what I'd seen. That hadn't been my face. It had been a man's face, older than mine, with features I didn't recognize. And the way he'd been staring, that empty, focused stare. I didn't sleep that night. I sat up in my bedroom with all the lights on, jumping at every creak and settling sound. When morning finally came, I called my boss and told her I needed a few days off. Then I called my sister and asked if I could stay with her for a while. "What's wrong?" she asked. "I just need to get out of this apartment for a few days," I said. "Please." I packed a bag and left that same morning, driving the 2 hours to my sister's place in Regina. I stayed there for 3 days, trying to convince myself I was being irrational, that I'd overreacted. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw that face in the window. On the 4th day, I forced myself to go back. I drove to Holdfast in the daylight, telling myself it would look different, less frightening. But when I pulled up in front of the building, I felt that same cold dread settle in my stomach. I went upstairs and started packing. I couldn't stay there anymore. I didn't care about losing my deposit or breaking the lease. I just needed to leave. I was loading boxes into my car when Gerald, the landlord, pulled up. He got out and walked over to me, looking concerned. "Moving out already?" he asked. "Yeah, something came up. I need to leave town." He nodded slowly, then hesitated, like he was trying to decide whether to say something. "Did something happen?" he finally asked. I almost didn't tell him, but something in his expression made me think he might actually believe me. "I saw a face in the kitchen window," I said. "A man's face, staring at me. The police said it wasn't possible, that there was no way anyone could have been there, but I saw it." Gerald's face went pale. He looked up at the second-floor windows, then back at me. "What did he look like?" he asked quietly. I described the face I'd seen, the pale skin, the wide eyes, the way he'd pressed against the glass. Gerald was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "The previous tenant died in that apartment. Old man named Harold Reichert. He lived there for 20 years, kept to himself. His daughter found him 3 days after he died. Natural causes," the coroner said. "Heart attack. He'd been in the kitchen, collapsed by the sink." I felt ice run down my spine. "By the sink?" "Yeah, right where you'd stand to wash dishes." He paused. "His daughter said he'd been trying to get to the window. That's how they found him on the floor, facing the window, like he'd been trying to reach it." "Why would he?" "I don't know. Maybe he was trying to signal for help. Maybe he saw something outside. We'll never know." Gerald looked uncomfortable. "I should have told you. But it was 2 years ago, and I needed a tenant, and I figured it didn't matter. It was just an old man who died of natural causes." "What else aren't you telling me?" I asked. He hesitated again. "The tenant before Harold said she saw things in that apartment too. Said she'd see a face in the window sometimes, late at night. She moved out after 6 months. Said she couldn't take it anymore." I finished loading my car that day and never went back. Gerald didn't try to charge me for breaking the lease. I think he knew he should have warned me, should have told me the apartment's history. I still think about it sometimes. About that face in the window, those wide, staring eyes. Was it Harold Reichert, somehow? Was he trying to show me what he'd seen in his final moments? Trying to communicate something he couldn't tell anyone when he was alive? Or was it something else entirely? Something that had been looking into that kitchen window for years, watching different tenants come and go, pressing its face against the glass? I don't know, and I'm terrified of finding out. My dad farmed 300 acres of wheat outside Macquarie, Saskatchewan, land that had been in our family since my great-grandfather homesteaded it in 1903. It was hard country, flat and windswept, where the winters were brutal and the summers were short. But the land was good for wheat, and my dad worked it the same way his father and grandfather had before him, with stubbornness and faith that the harvest would come. Every spring, my dad would put up scarecrows in the fields to keep the birds away. They were crude things, nothing fancy, just old clothes stuffed with straw and mounted on wooden frames made from fence posts. He'd position them throughout the fields, their ragged arms spread wide, their burlap sack faces blank and featureless, except for the crude stitching he'd used to mark eyes and a mouth. I was 18 that fall, home from my first semester of college, to help with the harvest. It was late September, and the wheat was ready, the heads heavy and golden under the autumn sun. My dad and I worked from dawn until after dark, running the combine through the fields, hauling the grain to the elevator in town, trying to get everything in before the weather turned. It was on the 3rd day of harvest that I first noticed the scarecrow had moved. We were working the south field, and I happened to glance toward the road that bordered our property to the north. There was a scarecrow standing near the fence line, maybe 20 yards from the road. I could see it clearly in the late afternoon light, the faded blue shirt, the worn denim pants, the tattered straw hat. I stopped what I was doing and stared at it, confused. That scarecrow should have been in the middle of the north field, at least a quarter-mile away from where it was now standing. "Dad," I called out over the noise of the combine. When he didn't hear me, I walked over to the truck where he was checking the grain sample. The scarecrow moved. He looked up from the grain. "What?" "The scarecrow in the north field. It's not where you put it. It's way over by the road now." My dad squinted across the distance, shading his eyes with his hand. "Huh. Must have blown over in that windstorm we had 2 nights ago. Probably some good Samaritan driving by saw it and propped it back up, didn't know where it was supposed to go." That made sense. We'd had strong winds earlier in the week, strong enough to knock over anything not properly secured. And people around here would do something like that, see a downed scarecrow, and take the time to stand it back up, even if they didn't put it in exactly the right spot. "I'll move it back tomorrow," my dad said, already turning back to his work. But the next day, when I went out to check on it, the scarecrow had moved again. It was closer now. Not by the road anymore, but halfway between the road and our property line, standing in an empty stretch of stubble where we'd already harvested. It was facing our direction now, facing the house and the barn, its ragged arms spread wide. I felt a chill run down my spine despite the warm afternoon sun. I walked out to where it stood and examined it closely. The wooden frame was intact, driven firmly into the ground. This hadn't fallen over and been moved by someone passing by. This had been deliberately picked up and relocated, and it had been positioned to face our house. "Dad," I called out. He was working on the combine, doing some maintenance between runs. He walked over, wiping his hands on a rag. "It moved again," I said, pointing at the scarecrow. He looked at it for a long moment without saying anything. I could see the confusion on his face, the same unease I was feeling. "That doesn't make sense," he finally said. "Who would be moving it, and why?" "Maybe it's someone's idea of a prank," I suggested, though I didn't really believe it. We didn't have close neighbors, and the road wasn't heavily traveled. Who would take the time to move our scarecrow around? "Well, whoever's doing it needs to cut it out," my dad said. "We've got work to do. I'll deal with it after we finish this field." But he didn't deal with it that day. We worked until dark and came in exhausted, and the scarecrow was forgotten until the next morning. I woke early, around 6, and looked out my bedroom window while I was getting dressed. The scarecrow was closer. It was standing in the yard now, maybe 50 feet from the house, near the old well pump. It was facing the house directly, its burlap sack face turned toward my window. The morning light caught the crude stitching that marked its eyes, making them look dark and hollow. I felt my heart start to beat faster. This wasn't right. This wasn't someone playing a prank. This was something else, something wrong in a way I couldn't articulate. I ran downstairs and found my dad in the kitchen, already making coffee. "Dad, the scarecrow." "I know," he said, cutting me off. His voice was tight. "I saw it when I got up. I'm going to take it down right now." We went outside together, and my dad walked over to the scarecrow while I hung back, watching. In the morning light, it looked even more unsettling, the clothes hanging loose on the frame, the straw stuffing visible through rips in the fabric, the blank face staring at nothing. My dad grabbed the wooden frame and pulled it out of the ground with a grunt. The scarecrow came apart in his hands, the frame, the clothes, the straw spilling out onto the ground. He gathered it all up in a pile. "Get me some gasoline from the barn," he said. I did as he asked, bringing back a jerry can. My dad doused the pile of clothes and straw with fuel, struck a match, and set it on fire. We stood there watching it burn, the flames consuming the old fabric and sending up black smoke that smelled like burning oil and scorched straw. "There," my dad said when it was reduced to ashes and charred wood. "That's the end of that." But it wasn't. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed listening to the house settle around me, feeling uneasy in a way I couldn't explain. Around midnight, I got up to use the bathroom, and on my way back to bed, I glanced out my window. The scarecrow was back. It was standing in the yard, in the exact same spot where my dad had burned it. Same blue shirt, same denim pants, same tattered straw hat, like we'd never touched it at all. I felt ice run through my veins. This wasn't possible. We'd burned it. I'd watched it turn to ash and smoke. There was no way it could be standing there in the yard. But it was. I stood at the window for a long time, staring down at that impossible figure. It was perfectly still, facing the house, its blank face turned up toward my window, and as I watched, I had the unshakable feeling that it was looking at me, that behind that burlap sack, behind those crudely stitched eyes, something was staring back. I wanted to wake my dad, wanted to tell him what I was seeing, but part of me was afraid that if I looked away, even for a second, the scarecrow would move again, would get closer. I don't know how long I stood there. Eventually, exhaustion won out, and I crawled back into bed, but I didn't sleep. I lay there with the blankets pulled up to my chin, listening to every creak and shift of the old house, imagining footsteps on the stairs, imagining that thing outside finding a way in. When morning came, the scarecrow was gone. There was no sign it had ever been there, no post hole in the ground, no scattered straw, nothing. Just empty yard and the morning sun casting long shadows across the stubble fields. At breakfast, my dad was quiet. He looked like he hadn't slept either, his face drawn and pale. "We're leaving," he said abruptly. "Today, we'll come back in the spring." "What about the harvest?" I asked. "We're not finished." "I don't care. We're leaving." He wouldn't explain further, wouldn't tell me what had changed his mind. But I saw the way he kept glancing out the window, the way his hands shook slightly as he held his coffee cup. He'd seen something too. Maybe not the scarecrow in the yard, maybe something else, something he wouldn't tell me about. But whatever it was, it had been enough. We packed that morning and left before noon, locking up the house and driving back to the city. My dad hired a contractor to finish the harvest, told him we'd had a family emergency. We didn't go back to the farm until the following April. When we finally returned, everything looked normal. The fields were bare, ready for spring planting. The house was cold and musty from being closed up all winter, but otherwise unchanged. There was no sign of the scarecrow anywhere, but I couldn't shake the memory of it. I couldn't forget the way it had stood in the yard, facing the house, seeming to watch my window. I couldn't forget the impossible fact that it had come back after we burned it. My dad never talked about what happened that fall. Whenever I tried to bring it up, he'd change the subject or leave the room. A few years later, he sold the farm and moved into town. He said he was getting too old for the work, that it was time to retire. But I think we both knew the real reason. I still dream about it sometimes. The scarecrow, standing in the field,